The day Alice Gentry rode into Dusty Creek, Nevada, with a broken wagon axle, a loaded rifle across her lap, and not a single soul she intended to ask for help, was the same day Owen Kendrick decided that the life of a solitary cowboy suited him just fine. It was the autumn of 1878, and the high desert stretched out in every direction like a painting God had finished in a hurry, all rust and sage, and the kind of silence that pressed against a person's ears until they could hear their own heartbeat. The town of Dusty Creek sat along the eastern edge of the Humboldt Valley, a modest collection of buildings that had survived drought, a railroad dispute, and two particularly bitter winters. It had a livery, a general store, a saloon, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a sheriff who spent more time whittling than enforcing the law. It was the kind of town that minded its own business, which suited most of the people who lived there just fine. Alice had been on the road for 11 days. She had come from Sacramento, traveling east, and she had made it farther than most people expected a woman alone would get, which was exactly the point. She was 26 years old. With dark hair she kept braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, brown eyes that had a way of measuring a person in the first 3 seconds of meeting them, and hands calloused from years of work that most women of her station were never supposed to do. She wore practical clothes, a canvas riding jacket over a sturdy cotton blouse, trousers she had altered herself because riding in skirts was something she had given up on at the age of 17. She carried a Winchester rifle, a hunting knife, and a small revolver tucked into the waistband of her trousers, and she knew how to use all three. She had also inherited, 6 months ago, a 40-acre parcel of land 3 miles east of Dusty Creek, left to her by an uncle she had met exactly twice in her life. She had no particular fondness for the memory of the man, but she had a great deal of fondness for the idea of land. Land meant independence. Land meant no one could tell her what to do or where to go or who she ought to be. Land was the one thing she had wanted since she was old enough to understand that most of the world was designed to make sure women like her never had any. The axle had broken on a stretch of rutted road 2 miles outside of town, and Alice had sat on the wagon seat for approximately 45 seconds before she climbed down, assessed the damage with the calm of a woman who had learned that panic was a luxury she could not afford, and began walking toward the distant smear of buildings on the horizon, leading her horse, a bay mare named Clover, by the reins. She left the wagon where it was. She would deal with it later. Owen Kendrick was leaning against the post outside of Hank Deaver's livery stable when she walked into town, and his first impression of her was that she walked like someone who had decided where she was going before she had even been born. He was 28 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who spent most of their time outdoors became weathered, with sun-darkened skin and pale green eyes that had a particular quality of stillness to them. He wore his hat pushed back on his head, his dark jacket dusty from a long morning of work, and he was, by his own admission and the admission of everyone who knew him, not a man who sought out complications. He had come to Dusty Creek 4 years ago after a stint driving cattle up from Texas, and he had stayed because the Henderson Ranch had offered him steady work, and because he had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he liked the valley. He was not a man of many words, not because he lacked for thoughts, but because he had learned early that most conversations were better left short. He had no wife, no particular prospects, and no burning desire to change either of those things. He had a small room above the livery that Hank let him use in exchange for morning and evening chores, a good horse named Sable, and a reputation in town for being reliable, fair-minded, and almost aggressively self-sufficient. He watched Alice Gentry walk into Dusty Creek, and something in the base of his chest did a thing he could not immediately identify. She walked straight to the water trough outside the livery, let her horse drink, and then turned and looked at him with those measuring eyes and said, "I need to know if there is anyone in this town who repairs wagon axles and whether they charge honest prices or take advantage of travelers." He considered her for a moment. Jake Priestley does repair work. He charges honest prices for honest folk. How does he determine who qualifies as honest folk? Generally by whether they try to bargain him down to nothing before he has even looked at the job. She nodded slowly, as if she was filing that information away. Where is his shop? End of Main Street, past the general store. You cannot miss it. He has got a wagon wheel nailed above the door. Thank you, she said, and she meant it purely as a transaction, a payment of words for information received. She picked up Clover's reins and began walking. Owen watched her go for 2 seconds before he said, without particularly planning to, "Your wagon give out on the eastern road." She stopped and turned. "Yes. I ride out that way most mornings, could take a look at it. 2 sets of hands make axle work go faster." She looked at him the way a person looked at an offer they were fairly certain had a catch buried somewhere in it. "I do not need assistance." He held up one hand, not in surrender exactly, but in a gesture of neutrality. "Did not say you did. Said 2 sets of hands make it go faster. That is just physics, not charity." She studied him for another moment. "I do not know your name." "Owen Kendrick. I work the Henderson Ranch." "Alice Gentry," she said. "I am going to speak to the repairman first. If I decide I want the help, I will find you." "Fair enough," he said. She walked away, and Owen turned back to the livery post and resumed leaning against it, and the thing in his chest did it again, that unidentifiable movement, and he thought with a kind of distant bewilderment that was singular. She came back 40 minutes later. He was still at the livery, now inside, rubbing down his horse after a morning ride, when he heard her footsteps on the wooden floor and turned. "Jake Priestley says he can repair the axle, but not until tomorrow morning. He has another job to finish today," she said. "He also said you are the person to talk to if I need a horse managed tonight, since the livery takes overnight boarders." "We do," Owen confirmed, giving Sable a final pat and hanging the brush back on its hook. $1.50 for the night, includes feed and water." "I will pay it," Alice said. "And if your offer of help with the axle tomorrow still stands, I would be willing to accept it. On the condition that it remains purely practical, and you do not feel the need to offer me unsolicited opinions about what a woman should or should not be doing on her own in the Nevada territory." He almost smiled, which for Owen Kendrick was approximately equivalent to another man bursting out laughing. "Deal," he said. She handed him the mare's reins and the payment, and she was turning to leave when he said, "Where are you staying tonight?" She paused. "I have not arranged that yet. Clara Bowen runs a boarding house on the south end of town. She is a fair woman and keeps a clean house. She also does not ask a great many questions, which I suspect you would appreciate." Alice turned back just far enough to look at him sideways. "You suspect a great many things about me very quickly." "I am a good judge of character," he said simply. "Comes from spending a lot of time watching horses and people, and they are not as different as either would prefer." This time she did not suppress whatever expression crossed her face entirely, and he caught the edge of something that might, in another woman's face, have been a smile. "Good night, Mr. Kendrick." "Night, Miss Gentry." She walked out into the golden late afternoon light, and Owen Kendrick stood in the dimness of the livery next to 2 horses and absolutely no one else, and said to no one in particular, "Funny. I needed no one until about 5 minutes ago." He wasn't sure he meant it as a joke. He wasn't entirely sure he meant it lightly at all. Clara Bowen was exactly the kind of woman Owen had described. Fair, practical, inclined to fill silences with gentle commentary on the weather and the state of the town, rather than personal questions. She gave Alice a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced east, so that the morning light came in golden and flat, and charged her a reasonable rate that included breakfast. Alice lay on the narrow bed that night, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling, and permitted herself, in the privacy of her own mind, a single thought. The cowboy by the livery had decent eyes. Not handsome, precisely, though he was that too in an uncomplicated, sun-worn way, but the eyes had been honest. In her experience, honest eyes were rarer than kind words, and considerably more valuable. She dismissed the thought and went to sleep. In the morning she was up before the sun, which was her habit. She ate breakfast in Clara's small dining room, nodded to the two other boarders, a traveling salesman from Reno and an elderly minister passing through on his way to Idaho, and was walking toward the livery before most of Dusty Creek had finished its coffee. Owen was already there. He had his horse saddled and had brought a second horse on a lead, a sturdy sorrel she did not recognize. Figured we would ride out, look at the wagon, take stock of what needs doing before Jake gets there with the parts, he said by way of explanation. She studied the second horse. You borrowed that from me. Hank lets me use the boarding horses for reasonable purposes. Riding out to help someone with a wagon qualifies. She could have said she was capable of walking. She had in fact planned to walk, which was why she had put on her good boots that morning. She could have pointed out that she had not asked him to arrange transportation. But it was practical and efficient, and she had already made the agreement, and so she simply took the reins and mounted with the ease of someone who had been riding since before she had learned to read. They rode out in the early morning quiet, the town falling away behind them, the desert opening up in shades of gold and gray and the deep dusty green of sage. The sky was enormous above them, shot through with the first pink light of sunrise, and Alice found herself looking at it longer than she intended, distracted by the way the color moved. You were in Sacramento? Owen asked, not as an intrusion but with the easy tone of a man who knew how to make conversation that sounded like silence. Yes, I worked as a seamstress for 7 years. She paused, and as a bookkeeper for the last 2. The shop owner preferred not to advertise that a woman was managing his accounts, so I did not receive appropriate credit for it, but I also received a reasonable salary which I saved. And now you have got land, he said. She glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead, his profile against the brightening sky. My uncle left it to me. He had no children. Have you seen it? Not yet. I have a deed and a description from the county surveyor. 40 acres with a creek running through the northern edge. She paused. And a structure. He described it as a house, but I suspect that word is doing a great deal of work. Owen made a sound that was not quite a laugh but acknowledged the observation. Most of what gets called a house out here started life as something considerably more modest. I know. I have been reading everything I could find about the territory for the past 4 months. She looked ahead at the road. I know what I am walking into. Do you know how to ranch? No, I intend to farm. A kitchen garden to start and then expand. The creek water means I do not have to rely entirely on rainfall. I know how to preserve food, I know how to manage accounts, and I have been studying agricultural manuals since January. She said it without defensiveness, as a statement of facts, but there was something underneath the facts, a quiet dare, as if she expected him to find a reason to doubt her and was prepared to answer it. He did not doubt her. He looked at the horizon and said, "The soil on that eastern stretch is decent. A little alkaline but workable. You would want to lime it before winter if you are planning to plant in spring." She turned to look at him properly. "You know that area. I have ridden it enough times. It is good land," he said. Your uncle knew what he was doing, picking it. Something in his voice was straightforward, without performance or condescension, and Alice found that it settled something in her chest in a way she had not expected. They reached the wagon in the full brightness of morning. Owen dismounted, crouched beside the broken axle, and was quiet for a long moment, turning the situation over with the kind of focused attention that reminded Alice of the way a good carpenter looked at a joint that wasn't sitting right. She stood beside him, also looking, and did not feel the need to fill the silence with words. "Straight break," he said finally. "Jake can fix this in a couple of hours if he has the right iron stock." He said he did. "Then you will be on your way by early afternoon." He stood, brushing dust from his knees, and looked at her. The morning light was fully out now, and it fell across his face in a way that showed the lines of it, the weathering and the steadiness behind it. "Your supplies in the wagon, everything all right?" "I lashed everything down before I walked to town," she said. "I am careful." "I noticed," he said, and there was no particular weight to it, just acknowledgement. They rode back to town. Jake Priestley arrived with his tools and his apprentice, a boy of 14 named Theodore who was intensely serious about everything, and Owen stayed to help lift and brace while Jake worked. Alice stood nearby and watched, and when there was something she could do, she did it without being asked. She noticed that Owen noticed this and did not comment on it, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated any compliment. By 11:30, the wagon was repaired. Alice paid Jake, who charged her exactly what he had quoted, and she thanked him with the kind of directness that made him blink slightly, because he was more accustomed to either flattery or argument. She was resecuring her lashed canvas when Owen appeared at the side of the wagon. "Heading out to the land today?" "Yes," she said. "I want to see it before it gets dark. The road from here to the eastern parcels goes past a gully where the trail is not well marked. You can miss the turn." She straightened and looked at him. "Is there another way to say what you want to say, or are you going to keep approaching it from the side?" He considered for a moment. There was that near smile again, barely there but real. "I was going to offer to ride out with you and show you the turn, just to the property line. You can do whatever you like from there." She thought about it. She had her hand-drawn map from the county surveyor, and it was entirely possible that the gully turn was marked on it. It was also entirely possible that it was not. She was a practical woman. "All right," she said. "I appreciate it." They rode together, the wagon rattling comfortably now that the axle was whole, Alice on the wagon seat and Owen on Sable beside her. The road opened out east of town, and the country became wilder, the sage thickening, the hills rising in the distance with their iron-red faces. A hawk turned slow circles overhead. A jackrabbit appeared and vanished in the brush. "You did this on your own," Owen said after a while. They had been riding in comfortable silence for 20 minutes, and it was the kind of observation that came out of a man who had been thinking it quietly and decided it was worth saying. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Sacramento to Nevada alone. You made the plan, saved the money, arranged the deed, packed the wagon. On your own." "Yes," she said, without particular pride but without false modesty either. "That is something," he said. "People do things on their own all the time. Women traveling alone to establish homesteads in the territory in the autumn of 1878 is not, precisely, something that happens all the time." She was quiet for a moment. "My mother told me when I was 12 years old that I had to learn to want only what a woman was permitted to want, or I would spend my whole life disappointed. I decided she was wrong." She looked ahead at the road. "I have spent a great deal of effort proving it." He was quiet for a while after that, and the silence was the respectful kind, the kind that acknowledged something had been said that deserved to sit without a response. The gully came up on the right side of the road, and the turn was indeed poorly marked, just a faint track through the sage that could easily be missed if you did not know to look for it. Owen pointed it out, and they took it, and after another 10 minutes they came over a rise and Alice saw her land for the first time. She had thought she was prepared for it. She had looked at maps and descriptions and had deliberately kept her expectations low, because she had learned that was the safest way to approach anything you wanted very badly. But even with low expectations, the sight of it took something from her and replaced it with something larger. The 40 acres rolled out in a long, gentle slope toward a line of cottonwood trees that marked the creek, their autumn leaves gone gold and shivering in the morning light. The grass was dry and winter yellow, but she could see that it was thick, and the soil at the edge of the track was dark beneath the surface dust. The structure that her uncle had generously called a house was visible from the rise, a one-room cabin built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, small and weathered but standing straight, and beside it what appeared to be the remains of a linta that had served as a shelter for animals. It was modest. It was imperfect. It was hers. She sat on the wagon seat and looked at it for a long moment, and she did not cry because she was not generally a person who cried easily, but something in her face softened in a way that Owen Kendrick, sitting quietly on his horse to her right, could see plainly. He did not say anything. He understood instinctively that this moment did not need words from him. After a minute, she picked up the reins and clicked to Clover, and they went down the slope to the cabin. It was sturdier inside than it looked from the outside. The logs set tight and chinked with dried mud that had held up well, the stone fireplace sound and clean. There were 2 wooden shelves, a rope-strung bed frame with a straw tick mattress that would need replacing, a heavy wooden table, and a single chair. The floor was packed earth. The one window had oilskin over it that had gone brittle and would need replacing with proper glass if she could manage it. "It is good bones," Owen said from the doorway. She turned. He had not come inside without being invited, had waited at the threshold, which she noted. "Yes," she said, "it is." The chimney looked clear from outside, but you should test it before you sleep here tonight. I was planning to do exactly that. She looked around the room again, already calculating, already making lists in her mind. "You rode out here for me today, that was kind of you. I have Tuesdays free," he said easily, "and I was curious about the land, nothing kind about curiosity." She looked at him steadily. "You are a strange kind of man, Mr. Kendrick." "In what way?" "You help without making a production of it. You make offers without attaching conditions to them. You do not treat me like I am something between amusing and pitiful, which is what most men do when they encounter a woman making choices they do not expect." He leaned against the door frame, considering that. "My mother was a practical woman," he said finally. "She ran the family farm in Kentucky for 4 years after my father broke his leg badly enough that he could not work. She made every decision, managed every account, bartered for what she needed, did what had to be done. She did not require anyone's approval to do it." He paused. "I grew up understanding that was just how capable people operated." Alice looked at him for a moment. "Your mother sounds like someone I would have liked." "She would have liked you," he said, and his voice was simple and certain, and that simplicity landed in Alice's chest in a way she did not entirely know how to account for. She tested the chimney that afternoon. It drew well. She swept out the cabin with a broom she had packed in the wagon and hung her blankets over the porch rail to air. Owen stayed longer than he had suggested he would, not by hovering, but by making himself useful without being asked. He repaired 2 of the lean-to's posts with lumber she had brought in the wagon specifically for the purpose of early repairs, having anticipated exactly this kind of need. He was good with his hands. She could see that in the way he worked, precise and unhurried. When the light began to go golden and long, she looked up from where she was working at the window frame and found him standing at the edge of the creek, looking at the water. She came and stood beside him. The creek was narrow but steady, flowing clear over flat stones. The cottonwoods were brilliant gold above it. "Good water source," he said. "Your uncle picked this parcel for the creek, I am certain of that." "I think he picked it knowing he would leave it to me someday," she said quietly. "He was eccentric. He understood things at an angle." She picked up a stone from the creek bank and turned it in her fingers. "He wrote me a letter 6 years ago when I was living in Sacramento. He said, 'Alice, I have a piece of the world set aside for you, because I have observed that you are the kind of person who needs a piece of the world to stand on and not much else.'" I thought it was one of his peculiar things to say. I kept the letter. Owen was quiet for a moment. "Sounds like he knew you well." "He knew the important things," she said. She put the stone in her pocket. She could not have explained why. He left before dark, which she expected. He shook her hand at the wagon with a formality that somehow managed to feel personal rather than distant, and said he would ride past in a few days to see how she was getting on if she had no objection. She should have had an objection. She had structured her entire journey around the principle that she would get on without anyone's help, would prove it to herself, and to the abstract audience of everyone who had ever told her that she could not manage alone. Owen Kendrick did not threaten that. She could not entirely explain why. He was not trying to manage her. He was not trying to rescue her. He seemed to be doing something that had no name she immediately recognized, something that looked, when she looked at it sideways, like genuine interest, the kind that did not want to own what it was interested in. "I have no objection," she said. He rode back toward Dusty Creek through the violet dusk, and Alice went inside to her cabin and lit a fire and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the world was the right size. He came back 3 days later, as promised, on a Thursday evening with a length of actual window glass, wrapped in cloth that he had ordered from the general store, and had, she would later discover, paid for himself. He presented it by holding it out and saying, "Figured you would want to replace the oilskin before the cold properly sets in." She looked at the glass and then at him and said, "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing. Consider it a housewarming." "I do not accept gifts from people I barely know," she said. "Then consider it a trade," he said without missing a beat. "I have been meaning to taste that bread I could smell from the creek bank. My nose says you baked today." She had baked that morning, a proper sourdough that she was proud of, using starter she had carried in a sealed crock all the way from Sacramento because she was exactly that kind of person. She looked at the glass which she needed, and looked at him, who was watching her with that steady, waiting look that seemed to operate without pressure, and said, "Come in, then." She set a place at the table, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight, and she sliced the bread, and there was butter she had traded Clara Bowen 2 hours of seamstress work for, and they ate and talked. Or rather, she talked and he listened, and then responded in a way that showed he had actually listened, which was different from how most conversations operated. He told her about the Henderson Ranch, where he had worked for 4 years, and about the cattle drives before that, and about Kentucky before everything else, the farm and his parents and a younger sister who had married a schoolteacher and moved to Ohio. Alice told him about Sacramento and the seamstress shop and the bookkeeping, and about the feeling she had carried for years of moving through a life that was too small for her, not in a dramatic way but in the way a coat fits wrong across the shoulders, not unbearable but constant. "And now?" he asked. "Now I have 40 acres, she said, "and a sound cabin and a creek and work to do. It fits." She said it with a quiet certainty that was not boasting but was, simply, the truth of how things felt. He nodded slowly. "That is a good thing to find," he said. "Most people spend their whole lives not finding it." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and said, "Have you found it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think I might be finding something in that direction," he said, and the way he said it was careful and honest both at once, and Alice felt her pulse do something unexpected, a small increase, a sharpening of awareness, and she thought, "Pay attention to that." He helped her fit the glass into the window frame before he left, because the measurements were right and the work would take 2 sets of hands. They worked in the close lamplight, their shoulders almost touching at one point when they both leaned in to check the fit of the putty at the lower corner, and she was very aware of the warmth of him beside her, which was a new kind of awareness, different from the practical noting of another person's presence. When it was done, he stepped back and she stepped back, and there was a moment of standing in the small cabin, the new window dark with night outside, and the lamp making everything amber and close, and neither of them said anything for a beat that lasted just a breath longer than ordinary. Then Owen put his hat on and said, "I will be back this way Sunday if that suits you." "Sunday suits me fine," she said. He came back Sunday, and on Sunday he brought 2 fence posts that she had mentioned were on her list of needs, and they spent the morning working on the fence line along the northern edge of the property near the creek. She had dug the post holes herself during the week, which he noted without saying anything dramatic about it, just picked up the conversation of the work where she had left it and kept going. In the afternoon they walked the whole property, all 40 acres of it, and she showed him her plans for where the kitchen garden would go and where she thought she might eventually build a proper fence for a few head of goats if she could manage it by next spring. "Goats are hardy," he said, considering the layout she had described. "They can handle the alkaline ground better than cattle, and the milk yield from 2 or 3 good does would supplement well." "I know," she said. "I have been reading about it." "Of course you have," he said, and this time the smile was fully there, a real one reaching his eyes, and it changed his face entirely. opened it up in a way that made him look younger and, if she was being honest with herself, which she generally was, considerably more attractive. She looked away at the horizon. They sat by the creek in the late afternoon, side by side on a flat rock, watching the water, and she asked him about the Henderson Ranch and whether he was content there, and he was quiet for a moment that she recognized as the kind of quiet where a person was deciding whether to say the real thing or the easier thing. He said the real thing. "I have been thinking about something for a while now. The Hendersons are good people and the work is fair, but I have always thought about land of my own. There is a parcel about a mile north of yours that has been on the market for 2 years. The price is right. I have the savings if I decide to move on it." She looked at him. "What is stopping you?" "Habit of caution, mostly," he said. "And the question of whether I want to take on something like that alone." He was looking at the water, not at her, and his voice was neutral enough that she could not quite read the edges of it. She thought for a moment about what he was and wasn't saying. Then she said, with the directness that was simply how she was built, "I said I needed no one when I came here. I have believed that for a long time, and I do not think it was wrong. I made it here. I will make this work." He turned and looked at her then fully, and his eyes were very still and very honest. "But," he said. "But," she said slowly, "I am beginning to think that what I meant was that I needed no one in the way that the world usually means it, the way that involves someone else deciding what you can do and who you can be." She turned the flat stone under her hand, the way she had turned that creek stone on the first day. "That is different from wanting company." "From wanting the right kind of company." Owen looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and careful, the way someone handled something they did not want to break. "I have been alone for a long time, by choice mostly. It suited me." "Mostly," she said. "I said I needed no one too," he said. "Thought it was just the truth of how I was made. Then I watched a woman walk into Dusty Creek and refused to ask anyone for directions." He paused. "I am still trying to account for what changed." She said nothing for a moment, because she was not the kind of person who rushed toward things or said what she felt before she had turned it over sufficiently. Then she said, "I think you should look at the parcel to the north." He raised his eyebrows slightly. "It would be useful," she said with careful lightness, "to have a neighbor who knows the land and is not unreasonable." Something moved across his face, warm and controlled at the same time, and he said, "Well, a man cannot argue with usefulness." The weeks that followed moved at the pace of autumn work, which was relentless and satisfying and left little room for anything that was not practical. Alice was up before sunrise every day, managing the property with the methodical energy of someone who had been planning this for years and was, finally executing the plan. She dug and turned and improved the kitchen garden plot, laid in provisions for winter, patched and improved the cabin's chinking, ordered seeds from a catalog through the general store, and made cautious and strategic use of her savings. She was not wasteful and she was not reckless, and she kept her accounts in a small leather ledger with the same precision she had kept the Sacramento shop owner's books, because she knew that the difference between a homestead that survived its first winter and one that did not was often just that kind of careful arithmetic. Owen came by on Tuesdays and Sundays, and sometimes on Thursday evenings if the ranch work finished early. He never arrived without something useful in hand: a coil of wire, a small load of firewood, a jar of the honey that Hank Deaver's wife kept bees for, and that Alice had mentioned once, offhandedly, that she had been missing, and she had given up trying to tell him to stop. He was not doing it out of the conviction that she could not manage. She had understood that early. He was doing it because he was a man who expressed what he felt through the things he did, and what he was feeling was, she suspected, becoming clearer to both of them. She looked forward to Tuesdays and Sundays in a way she had not looked forward to things in a very long time. He rode out to look at the parcel to the north in October, and he came to her door the following Sunday with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who had made a decision. "I am going to buy it," he said. She felt something warm move through her chest. She kept her face composed because she was still Alice Gentry and she did not perform feeling she was still working out. "Good," she said. "When?" "I am meeting with the land agent in Elko next week. The price they quoted is fair, and it will not break my savings." He turned his hat in his hands. Once, a tell she had come to recognize as the one he had when he was about to say something that required more than practical words. "I want you to know why I am doing it." "I suspect I know why," she said. "I suspect you do too," he said. "But I am going to say it anyway because I think you are the kind of person who appreciates things being said plainly." "I am," she said. He looked at her steadily, those pale green eyes quiet and certain. "I am buying that land because this valley is where I want to be, and this valley is where you are. And I am not in any hurry, and I am not making assumptions, but I want to be close enough that when you want company, I am the company that is available." The afternoon light came in golden through the new glass window and lay in a square on the packed earth floor. The fire was going in the fireplace, and the cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs she had hung from the rafters. It was the most honest room Alice had ever stood in, and Owen Kendrick was the most honest person she had met in a very long time, and she thought, "This is the part where I could say something small and safe, or I could be as honest as he is being." She was not built for small and safe. "I would like that very much," she said. "More than I expected to want anything that I did not plan for myself." He breathed a quiet release, and the control in his face opened up into something that was not quite the smile she had seen but was something richer, a genuine ease, like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had finally set it down in the right place. "Well then," he said, "I had better get to Elko." He bought the land. He told her about the meeting on the following Sunday. Sitting at her kitchen table with coffee she had made from the small supply she kept for exceptional occasions, because she had decided this qualified. The deed was signed. 160 acres to the north of her property, with a seasonal stream and good grazing land and a larger structure than her cabin that would need considerable work. "I have got Tuesdays and Sundays free from the ranch still, at least until spring," he said. "I can work on the property in the off hours." He looked at his coffee cup. "It will take time." "Most things worth doing take time," she said. He looked up at her, and the look between them was the kind that had been building for weeks, layered and certain, and Alice thought, "There it is." He set his coffee cup down and said, "Alice." "Yes," she said quietly. "I would like to take you to supper at the hotel in Dusty Creek. On a proper evening, if you are willing." She considered it for a moment, not because she was uncertain but because she liked the way it felt to hold the warmth of something before she answered it. Then she said, "I am willing." They went that Saturday. Alice put on the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool she had sewn herself 3 years ago and kept for significant occasions. She pinned her hair up with care and looked at herself in the small mirror in the cabin and felt, to her own surprise, quite well about what she saw, which was not something she spent a great deal of time thinking about ordinarily. She felt well because she was going somewhere she wanted to go with someone she wanted to be with, and that was a sensation she had denied herself so often, in service of practicality and independence, that it felt new and extraordinary and entirely right. Owen was waiting outside the hotel when she arrived on Clover, and he helped her down from the horse with a hand at her elbow that was correct and careful, and he had made some effort himself. She noticed a clean shirt and a dark jacket that fit him well, and he had combed his hair, which usually did as it pleased under his hat. He looked at her for just a moment before he offered her his arm, and the look was private and complete just for her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she said, and took his arm, and they went inside. The hotel dining room was the best establishment in Dusty Creek, which in Dusty Creek terms meant it had tablecloths and a proper kerosene chandelier, and a cook who had once worked in a San Francisco restaurant before following a woman he loved to the Nevada territory, a choice that had worked out better for the restaurant's customers than for the man himself, who had been politely returned to cooking within a year of the marriage. The food was genuinely good. They sat across from each other at a table by the window, and Alice noticed that several people in the room looked at them with the particular attention that small towns paid to anything that constituted news, and she met every gaze calmly and returned to her dinner partner, who seemed entirely untroubled by it. "People are interested in us," she observed. "People in Dusty Creek are interested in everything that can be observed from within 30 feet, he said, without particular concern. "It is a small town. Let them be interested." She liked that. She liked that he was not self-conscious and was not trying to manage her response to the attention. She picked up her fork and said, "Tell me about Kentucky. Tell me the actual story, not the outline." He told her. She listened with the quality of attention she brought to everything that mattered to her, and what he told her was the story of a family that had worked hard and loved well and lost some things and held on to the important ones. And it was an ordinary story in all the ways that made a story real rather than theatrical. His father, who had been a stubborn and sometimes difficult man, but who had a gift for knowing which soil would yield and which would not. His mother, who had run the farm those 4 years and had not accepted help she did not ask for, but had known how to ask when it was needed. His sister, Clara, who had written him letters full of news about her schoolteacher husband and their 2 children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3, and who teased Owen in the letters about when he was going to stop wandering. "What do you tell her?" Alice asked. He looked at her across the table with the candlelight in his eyes. "I have been telling her I have not found what I am looking for yet," he said. "I believe I may have to revise that." Alice held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said, "Tell your sister you found something worth stopping for." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she let him, and the warmth of it moved from her hand up through her whole arm and settled somewhere near her sternum, solid and quiet, and she thought, "Yes, this is what the land felt like when I first saw it. This is the right size." They walked after dinner, slow through the quiet main street of Dusty Creek, her hand tucked through his arm, the night sky overhead absolute and full of stars in the way that only high desert nights managed. They talked about everything and nothing, about winter preparations and the spring planting and a book she had been reading and an argument Owen had with the Henderson Ranch's foreman about the right way to treat a horse with a strained leg. And they laughed, which was something Alice had not done easily in a long time, and it felt astonishingly natural. When they reached the spot where she had left Clover, she untied the mare's reins from the post and turned to face him. He was standing close enough that she could see the clear detail of his expression in the starlight, and what was there was warmth and certainty and that particular quality of his that she had come to think of as his essential nature, honest and unhurried. "I would like to do this again," she said. "I intend to suggest it often," he said. She looked up at him for just a moment, and then she stood on her toes and pressed her lips to his jaw, the edge of it near his ear, and she felt him go very still and then breathe out, a long, quiet breath. She stepped back. "Good night, Owen," she said. "Good night, Alice," he said, and his voice was different in a way she carried home with her all 3 miles, turning it over in her pocket like a creek stone. The winter settled in properly in November, which it did in the Humboldt Valley by degrees, the nights going sharp and the days short and gold. Alice had laid in what she needed, and the cabin held its warmth well, and she was busy and productive and content in a way that was different from any contentment she had known before, because it had company in it now, deliberate company, chosen company, and that was not what she had expected of herself, and was considerably better for it. Owen's work on his own property began in earnest on the weekends, and she rode north sometimes on Sundays to help, because she was not someone who could stand by while work was being done within her sight. The structure on his property turned out to be larger than the cabin her uncle had left her, 2 rooms instead of 1, with a proper floor and a loft, and it needed work, but it had the same good bones as hers. She helped him think through what needed doing and in what order, which was something she was good at. He did the heavy physical labor, which he was good at, and they had conversations across the work that ranged from practical to philosophical and back. And she found that she looked forward to those conversations, the way she had never quite managed to look forward to conversations before. One afternoon in late November, working by the light of a lantern on his property's front room floor while he was sealing a crack in the wall, and she was sorting through a crate of hardware he had brought from town, she found herself watching him and thinking, with the kind of clarity that came from months of slow, honest accumulation, that she was in love with him. She examined the thought the way she examined everything, thoroughly and without sentiment, looking for the places where it might be imprecise or premature. She found none. She was in love with Owen Kendrick in the way that a person who had spent years insisting she needed no one loved the first person who had ever made that statement feel, not wrong exactly, but magnificently unnecessary. She went back to sorting hardware. He turned from the wall and saw her and said, "What are you thinking?" She looked up. "That you have sealed that crack twice now, and you are going to need to use a different mixture if it is going to hold through the freeze." He looked at the wall, at the crack. "I know," he said. "I was thinking the same thing." She held out the jar of mixed mortar she had quietly been adjusting the proportions on for the past 10 minutes. He looked at it and then at her, and that warm, knowing quiet of his filled the space between them. "You fixed the mixture," he said. "I did," she said. "You would have gotten there." "Eventually," he acknowledged. He took the jar. Their fingers touched in the exchange and neither of them pulled back, and he held the jar in one hand and looked at her in the lantern light and said, very quietly, "Alice." "Yes," she said. "I think you know that I am very much in love with you." She held his gaze. She did not look away or create distance or retreat into irony. She said, "I think you know that I am very much in love with you too." He set the jar down on the floor with great care, as if it were delicate, which it was not, and he crossed the small distance between them, and he took her face in both his hands, those careful calloused hands, and he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been certain and patient and had arrived at the right moment, and Alice kissed him back with the same certainty, because she had always, in everything she did, committed fully to what she decided was right. When they pulled back, the lantern was still burning and the night was cold outside, and inside the unfinished room everything smelled of sawdust and mortar and wood smoke, and Owen Kendrick pressed his forehead to hers and said, "Well, well," she agreed. The winter deepened, and they moved through it together in the way that people who have found each other in the practical landscape of real life move together, not with dramatic declarations at every turn, but with the consistent and building presence of two people who have decided that the other one is worth choosing, every day, in the small and large ways that make up a life. He asked her to marry him in December on a Sunday at her kitchen table over coffee, without ceremony but with everything he had. He put a small ring on the table between them, silver with a tiny garnet that had belonged to his mother, which his sister had sent him in a letter after he had written asking for it, and Clara's accompanying letter had said simply, "It is about time, Owen, it is about time," and he had carried it in his breast pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the right morning. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She said, "You are asking me to marry you, not to stop being what I am." "I would not know how to ask that," he said, "and I would not want to, even if I did." She picked up the ring and looked at it, the small dark red garnet, the simple silver band. She thought about her mother, who had told her to want only what women were permitted to want. She thought about the cramped seamstress shop in Sacramento and the ledger books that bore her work and another man's name. She thought about the 40 acres and the creek and the cottonwoods gone gold in October, and the way Owen had stood at the edge of that creek the first day she had seen it and not said a single word because he had understood she needed the silence. She put the ring on her own finger and said, "Yes." He reached across the table and took her ringed hand in both of his, and he looked at it for a moment with that expression she had come to know, that warm and controlled and entirely real thing. And then he looked up at her, and she leaned across the table and kissed him, and the fire crackled in the grate. And outside, the Nevada winter was cold and vast and stunningly beautiful. They married in the spring in April of 1879, when the desert was briefly, improbably green, and the creek was running high, and the cottonwoods had come back to leaf. They married in the small church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and it was a small ceremony because they were both people who kept their most important things close. Clara Bowen was there, and Jake Priestley and old Theodore the apprentice, who was still intensely serious about everything, and the Henderson family and a few others from town. Owen's sister Clara, the actual Clara, his sister in Ohio, had written a letter that arrived 4 days before the wedding, full of joy and instruction, and the specific warmth of someone who had waited a long time to welcome someone into the family. She had not been able to travel in time, but she had promised to come in summer, and Alice had written back a letter of her own that was shorter and more direct than Clara's, but that said, genuinely, that she was looking forward to meeting her very much. The minister who performed the ceremony was the same elderly minister who had been staying at Clara Bowen's boarding house on the day Alice arrived in Dusty Creek, now passing back through on his way south from Idaho. He found this coincidence charming. Alice found it reasonably appropriate. Owen said nothing about it but shook the man's hand afterward with a warmth that the minister later described to anyone who would listen as the most gratifying part of the whole journey. There was a supper afterward at the hotel, the same dining room where they had sat on that first proper evening together, and there was dancing in the street outside because someone brought out a fiddle and someone else had a harmonica, and Alice Gentry, who was now Alice Kendrick and had thought very carefully about that name before deciding it, was one she was choosing fully and freely. Danced with her husband under the April stars while the fiddle played something fast, and the sage-scented air was soft, and the whole of Dusty Creek was briefly, unreservedly happy. She stopped in the middle of the dancing and looked at him, this particular man who had leaned against a livery post and watched her walk into town 5 months ago, and then followed the simple thread of what was true without pulling it too hard or letting it go, and she thought, what an unlikely, perfect, right thing this is. He was looking at her in exactly the same way. "What are you thinking?" she asked, which was the question they had taken to asking each other when the other one went quiet in an interesting way. "That I am glad you rode into town with a broken axle," he said. "You are a terribly romantic man," she said. "I am a man with a broken axle to thank for the best thing that has happened to him," he said. "I am not going to pretend otherwise." She laughed, and it was the easy, natural laugh that she had not had before and now could not imagine doing without, and she took his hand and they danced again, and the fiddle played, and the desert night was enormous and close all at once. They spent their first married spring doing what they had each been doing separately, working. But now the work was interwoven in the way of two people building a shared life, rather than two adjacent solitary ones. Alice had her 40 acres and Owen had his 160, and they worked both, dividing the days with practical logic and riding the mile between the properties with comfortable frequency. They talked seriously, in the evenings at Alice's kitchen table, which had become their evening table by habit, about how they wanted to manage the land going forward. Owen had ideas about the grazing capacity of his northern acres, and Alice had plans for expanding the kitchen garden to a proper market garden by the 2nd year. And these ideas fit together the way good plans fit, when the people making them have the same fundamental understanding of what they are trying to build. In the matter of independence, which Alice had always known was central to who she was, he was as good as his word. He did not manage her property or her decisions. He offered opinions when she asked for them and held his tongue when she did not. He learned her way of working and she learned his, and they negotiated the natural friction of two self-sufficient people sharing space with the same directness and lack of drama that characterized everything else between them. She kept her name on the deed to her 40 acres. He had never suggested otherwise. Clara Kendrick, Owen's sister, arrived in June, and she was a person Alice liked immediately, not because she was easy or undemanding. She was neither, but because she was honest and funny and looked at Alice with a frank assessment that Alice recognized as the expression of a woman who needed to know the real thing rather than the pleasant surface. After approximately 20 minutes of conversation, Clara said, "You are exactly what he needed and exactly what I hoped, and I am very glad." And Alice said, "I find him to be the same for me." And that was the friendship settled. Clara stayed 3 weeks, and in that time she and Alice fell into the kind of easy rapport that felt much older than it was, and Owen watched them together with a visible happiness that Alice found particularly moving, because it was not the carefully managed happiness he showed most of the world. It was something unguarded. The summer was good. The garden produced well, better than Alice had projected, because the soil had responded generously to the work she had put into it over the winter, and she expanded her plans for the following year. Owen's north property took shape steadily, and he began making inquiries about stock, a careful and methodical process that she appreciated because it matched her own approach to things. In August, Alice discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days, not because she was troubled by it, she was not, but because she was a person who needed to fully understand what she felt before she spoke it. What she felt was a layered thing. Joy, yes, deep and real, and also a kind of thoughtful gravity, the weight of a responsibility she wanted to be fully equal to. She had not been raised with a particular faith in institutions or in the idea that women's lives were naturally structured around motherhood, and yet she found, turning this knowledge over, that she wanted this with a completeness that surprised even her. On the 4th day, she told Owen. He was at the fence line near the creek, working on a section that needed restringing, and she walked out to him in the morning and said, "I am going to have a baby." He turned from the fence, and the thing that happened to his face was something she had never seen before, a complete unguarded openness. Everything he was right at the surface, no management of it at all. He set down his tools and came to her and took her hands and said, "Are you all right? Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have been working it out in my mind for a few days. I wanted to be sure of what I felt before I told you." He looked at her for a long moment, her hands in his. "And what do you feel?" "Ready," she said. "Happy, serious about it." She looked at him steadily. "What do you feel?" He lifted her hands to his mouth and pressed them there, the backs of her hands against his lips, his eyes closed. And that was his answer. And she stood in the morning sun beside the creek with the cottonwoods whispering overhead and the water running clear over the flat stones, and she was happier than she had ever thought to be. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which matched Alice's general relationship with her own body, which she had always treated as a working thing to be maintained and respected, and not overly fussed with. She kept working through the autumn with adjustments for common sense, and she let Owen take over the heavier lifting without making it a matter of principle, because she had learned by now to distinguish between independence and stubbornness, and she understood that the first was essential and the second was sometimes just foolish. She also, for the first time in her life, went to Clara Bowen and to the Henderson Ranch's women who had experience in the matter, and asked practical questions, and she listened to the answers without the defensiveness that would have made her not ask at all a year ago. She could ask now. She had learned with Owen, and with this community she was slowly and genuinely becoming part of, that needing some things from other people was not the same as being diminished by them. She wrote to her mother in Sacramento for the first time in 3 years. The letter was not long and it was not effusive, but it told the truth of where she was and how she had gotten there, and she sent it with the expectation of no particular response, though she found, as the weeks passed, that she hoped for one. Her mother wrote back. The letter arrived in October, and it was careful and somewhat formal, in the way of someone writing across a great distance of time in silence, but there was something at the end of it that Alice read and then read again. Her mother had written, "I told you to want only what women were permitted to want. I told you that because I was frightened of what wanting more would cost you. I see now that I was the one who was wrong, and I am glad to be wrong." Alice folded the letter and put it in the same box where she kept her uncle's letter, and she sat for a while in the lamplight and felt the particular quality of something that had been waiting a long time to be set down. The baby came in January of 1880, on a cold and brilliant morning when the desert was rimed with frost and the sky was the color of steel going blue. It was a boy. They had not discussed names at great length because names were a private thing, and they had both understood they would know it when the time came. And when Owen held his son for the first time, he looked at the small, red-faced, furious life of him and said, "James, James Kendrick." For his grandfather, he explained, who had known which soil would yield. Alice looked at the baby in Owen's arms, this particular new person who had come into the world on an extraordinary morning in the Nevada Territory, and she felt something so large and so specific that she thought she might need a whole new vocabulary for it. "James," she said, trying it. The baby turned toward the sound of her voice with the blind, instinctive certainty of new things, and Owen laughed, a full, real laugh, and brought the baby to her. And the three of them were in the warm cabin with the fire going and the frost on the windows and the whole wide world outside. The years that followed built themselves the way good things build, not dramatically but solidly. James was a determined and curious child who walked early and talked constantly, and had his father's steady eyes and his mother's way of watching a situation carefully before deciding what to do about it. He followed Owen around the property with the devoted intensity of a child who has found the person he most wants to understand, and he followed Alice around the kitchen garden and the cabin with the same intensity, so that he grew up knowing how to plant and tend and harvest alongside knowing how to read the land and manage stock, and Alice was very deliberate about making sure that this was so, because she believed that the limitations of what a person could do should never be written in by birth or circumstance. By 1882, the Kendrick properties were running together in practical partnership, though the deeds remained separate, which had been Alice's stipulation and Owen's unquestioned agreement. Owen had the North 160 running with a modest herd of cattle and a good number of sheep, and Alice had expanded her market garden to the full productive extent of the South 40 and was supplying Dusty Creek and occasionally the larger town of Elko to the east. She had hired 2 women from town to help with the expanded work, both of whom she paid a fair wage and treated with the consideration she had always believed she deserved and rarely received in Sacramento. In the spring of 1882, she found herself expecting again. This time she told Owen the same evening she knew, sitting across from him at the supper table with James already asleep in his corner of the cabin's expanded back room, because she had found in 3 years of marriage that the space between knowing and telling had shrunk to almost nothing, which was a thing she had not expected of herself but found she did not want to argue with. "Are you glad?" he asked. "Are you?" she countered. "I asked first," he said, and there was that smile, the real one, the one that changed his face entirely. She smiled back. "Yes," she said, "I am." "Then so am I," he said, which was already true before you answered. She threw a small piece of bread at him, which was something she would never have done before Owen Kendrick and now did with relative frequency, and he caught it with the reflex of a man who had learned to expect exactly this kind of thing and ate it. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1882, and they named her Ruth, after Owen's mother. She had Alice's dark hair and Owen's stillness, and she was the kind of child who listened to everything with enormous eyes before she acted on any of it, which Owen said was clearly from Alice's side of the arrangement, and Alice said was rich coming from the most quietly observant man in Nevada. James was 2.5 when Ruth was born, and he received her with the solemn interest of a small person confronting a very important development, and within a week had appointed himself her primary expert and her shadow, which was something he maintained for years afterward. Dusty Creek grew in those years as the territory grew, more families coming in on the railroad that now ran through Elko and spreading out into the valley land. The town acquired a proper doctor, a young woman from Illinois named Dr. Harriet Cole, which caused considerable discussion and some resistance, and also considerable relief among the women of the town, who had previously had to rely on the nearest physician 2 towns over. Alice made sure to be among the first to welcome Dr. Cole, and she made sure it was a welcome that communicated clearly that she was not just tolerated but valued, because she understood something about arriving somewhere with competence and having to fight for the basic recognition of it. Owen and Alice had a dinner for Dr. Cole at their expanded cabin, which by 1883 had grown to 4 proper rooms and a real wooden floor and actual glass in all 3 windows, and invited several others from town who they thought would be good for the doctor to know. It was the kind of hospitality that was Alice's specifically, thoughtful and purposeful, designed not for show but for connection, and Owen supported it with the ease of a man who had long ago understood that his wife's intelligence about people was one of the best things about being married to her. Life had its difficulties, because life was the territory and the territory was not easy. There was a drought summer in 1883 that threatened the garden severely, and Alice managed it with a combination of the creek water she used carefully and a rotation of drought-resistant plantings she switched to in June when the signs were clear, and she lost less of the yield than anyone expected. The Hendersons lost a portion of their cattle that summer and Owen helped them manage it, because that was the kind of neighbor and former employee he was, and Alice sent food from what the garden produced that summer and did not make anything of it. There was a boundary dispute with a property to the east of Alice's 40 acres, a newcomer who arrived in 1884 with inflated ideas about where his property line ran. Alice dealt with it herself, first by going to the county surveyor's records, which she had kept meticulous copies of, and then by meeting with the man directly and showing him, with the calm precision of someone who had been keeping accounts and reading documents for 15 years, exactly where his property ended and hers began. He attempted to bluster, and she waited it out with the patience she kept in reserve for exactly these occasions, and when he had finished, she said, in a voice of perfect pleasantness, that she was confident they could have the county surveyor confirm the line at his expense if he preferred official verification, and that she would be happy to recommend a fair and honest surveyor. He agreed to the boundary as documented. When she told Owen that evening, he said, with great sincerity, that he was glad he had never in his life tried to argue a property line with her. "You would not have had to," she said. "You have always known where your land begins and mine ends." He looked at her across the supper table in the lamplight, their 2 children asleep in the back room, and he said, "I have always known that about you, Alice, about where you begin and where you end. It has never seemed like something to argue with." She looked at him, this man who had leaned against a livery post in the autumn of 1878 and offered to help with a wagon axle as a matter of simple practical physics, and had turned out to be the one person she had never anticipated needing and could not now imagine being without. "I love you," she said, not as a performance or a formality, but as a simple and complete statement of fact. "I know," he said. "I love you." In a way that has only gotten larger with everything that has happened. She reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat like that for a while, not talking, not needing to, the fire going and the children asleep and the desert night enormous and silent outside, and the life they had built together present and solid and real in every direction. James Kendrick, at 7 years old, had developed a passion for horses that his father recognized with deep familiarity, and his mother encouraged with the same deliberate care she brought to everything she wanted to grow properly. He was already, at 7, helping Owen with the gentling of young horses on the north property, learning the language of patience and attention that was required, and Owen taught him the way he did everything, without drama, by showing rather than explaining, by letting the boy find his own understanding of it through careful observation. Alice watched them together in the corral one October afternoon, her son and her husband moving around a young roan mare that was still uncertain of people, and she thought about how strange and good it was, the unexpected shape of the life she had made. She had ridden into Dusty Creek insisting she needed no one, and she had meant it in the deepest sense, the self-protective, years-earned sense of a woman who had learned to rely on herself, because relying on others had too often meant being diminished by them. She had been right about what she did not need. She did not need someone to manage her or decide for her or limit her. She had been wrong about what she did need, which was this, the particular this of Owen Kendrick and 2 children and 40 acres, and a creek, and a life built with her own hands and her own choices, complicated by love in the best way that things could be complicated. Ruth at 3 came toddling across the yard toward her, earnest and determined, holding a flat stone she had found with the focused delight of a child who has discovered treasure. "Mama," she said, presenting the stone, "for you." Alice crouched down and received it solemnly, turning it in her fingers. It was a piece of pale quartz with a vein of pink through it. "It is beautiful, Ruth." "I found it by the creek," Ruth said, satisfied. Alice put the stone in her pocket, the way she had put the first creek stone in her pocket on the day she had arrived and seen her land for the first time, and she thought that her pockets were full of good stones from this land, and that was not a small thing. In the spring of 1885, Owen's sister Clara and her family finally made the journey west, her husband the schoolteacher and both children, the boy now 12 and the girl 10. They stayed for a month, crowding the cabin happily and spilling out into the Nevada spring with the delight of people who had grown up in Ohio, and found the high desert to be an astonishing and foreign country. Clara and Alice became fully and firmly friends in that month, the kind of friendship that did not require frequency to hold, and they wrote letters afterward that maintained it across the distance. Clara said, on the last evening of the visit, sitting with Alice on the porch while the men and children were in the barn at something Owen was showing the Ohio boy about tack repair, "You are the best thing that has happened to my brother. You should know that. He was whole before, but you are the thing that made him full." Alice considered this for a moment, looking at the sunset over the Humboldt Valley, the colors enormous and improbable across the western sky. She said, "He is the same for me, but I want to be precise about it. He did not complete me, I was complete, he expanded me." Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, that is a better way to say it, that is the right way to say it." "I know," Alice said, without arrogance, just sureness. "I have had 6 years to work out the words." The years continued, measured in seasons and work and growth. The kitchen garden became a proper enterprise. Owen's cattle and sheep flourished. James grew into a quiet, capable boy who was already, at 10, the best horse reader in the valley beside his father. Ruth grew into a fierce and curious girl who reminded Alice, in specific moments, very much of herself, and who Alice was very careful to tell, as often as it was true and meaningful, that she could want anything she was capable of wanting, and that the world's permissions had no particular authority over her. The cabin was properly a house by 1886, expanded and improved over the years with the careful application of savings and work, and the good sense of 2 people who knew how to plan. It had a sitting room, a proper kitchen, 3 bedrooms and the loft, a real covered porch that ran the length of the front, and where Alice kept a wooden chair where she sat in the evenings when the work was done and looked at her land and the creek and the cottonwoods, which turned gold every October as reliably as anything in the world. Owen was there beside her on an evening in the October of 1886, sitting in his own chair, which had appeared on the porch the year after hers without any particular ceremony. James was inside at the table doing the reading his mother set for him, which was considerably more rigorous than what the Dusty Creek School provided. Ruth was asleep already, having spent the day in an adventure of her own devising that had left her thoroughly tired. The valley was purple and gold in the last light. The creek could be heard from the porch, which it could always be heard on still evenings. The sage smell was in the air and the first sharpness of October cold. "Are you happy?" Owen asked. He asked it the way they asked each other things by now, without preamble, because they had long since established between them that direct questions deserved direct answers, and that the asking was never a burden. Alice looked at her land. She looked at her house, felt the solidity of it behind her. She thought about the 40 acres she had arrived at with a broken axle and a rifle across her lap, and not a single person she intended to ask for help. She thought about where she had come from and what she had made and who she had found along the way, and she thought about the 2 children inside and the man beside her and the creek she could hear and the stone in her pocket, the one Ruth had given her that spring, which had joined the other stones she kept. "Yes," she said, "completely." She looked at him. "Are you?" He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and he held it the way he had held it for 7 years, with certainty and care, with the particular steadiness that was simply who he was. "I am the happiest man in Nevada," he said. "Possibly the territory. I am not going to argue the broader geography." She laughed and he laughed, and the October evening settled around them, and the creek ran, and the cottonwoods were gold, and the children were safe inside, and Alice Gentry Kendrick sat on the porch of her own home on her own land in the Humboldt Valley with the one person she had never expected and could not now imagine existing without. And she thought that this, all of this, was exactly what was possible when a woman refused to want only what she was permitted to want. She had needed no one. And then she had met Owen Kendrick, who had needed no one either, right up until about 5 minutes after she walked into Dusty Creek. The stars came out, one by one and then all at once, the way they did in the high desert, and the night was enormous and full and entirely, completely theirs.